Go ahead and call the meeting to order. Don't take their seats. Today, the full committee is hearing is on national security challenges and U.S. military activities in Europe. We have Ms. Laura Cooper, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And we have General Todd Walters, who is the Commander, U.S. European Command. As this is, again, a hybrid hearing, I will begin by reading the rules for said hybrid hearing. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. These members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance, unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, I've never understood that part, by the way, but I keep reading it. They should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. With that, as I said, we are here to hear about the European Command and the issues in that area. And as with all parts of the world, there are, of course, many, I think, top of mind for all members at the moment is what's going on in Ukraine, in Russian activities in that region in general, how we are working with Ukraine and our allies in the region to deal with the threat that Russia poses, what the best steps forward are, and how we can best help the European Command meet that threat. We also continue to be very concerned about our relationship with Turkey, incredibly important relationship. They are a key ally in many respects, but still problematic in a number of other respects, most notably with the S-400 purchase and the sanctions that have been levied on them as a result. So curious to hear how that relationship is going forward. We've also bounced around a little bit in the last couple of years in terms of how to exactly posture our forces in Europe. I think we are now in a good place. Would be anxious to hear from both of you about how you see that going forward. Are there changes that are necessary? What support could we offer if those changes are required? In particular, there's the one issue of, as our relationships with Poland, Romania, Ukraine, other Eastern European countries go forward, how does that shift our focus from where our troops have traditionally been stationed? I know one big question has always been, should we have permanently stationed troops or rotational troops? And there's disagreement in the Pentagon about how best to handle that. Would be curious on your take. But the overarching issue that I want to leave you with is an issue that affects the entire DoD and all of the theaters that we're engaged in, and that is the changing nature of warfare. And I think the European Command is best suited to look at this because of Russian activities. What Russia did in Crimea a number of years ago, what they continue to do in the eastern Ukraine, the information operations that they are engaged in across the frontier is sort of cutting edge on where we're heading. And what this committee is really focused on is how can we make sure that we are purchasing the equipment and being in a position to deal with the world of warfare as it exists now. And what that means, basically, is the incredible importance of command and control information and technology. Whoever possesses the best information is in the best position to be successful. And there are a lot of technologies that are key to this, certainly artificial intelligence, because you also have to process whatever information is coming in. The better you're able to process that, the better you are. You also have to be able to protect your command and control and information systems. There are a number of different ways to do that. We are not ideally suited right now to protect those systems. It's like being heckled at a comedy club. Okay, I'll grant you that wasn't my strongest point, but I'm working on it here. Just taking it off the top of my head. So the point is that transition, to my mind, is the single most important thing that we can do in terms of deterring our adversaries. Certainly Russia, but China as well, transnational terrorist groups, and we are beginning to make that transition. We've seen it with the bottom-up review, the blank slate review, whatever you want to call it, what the Marine Corps is doing as it's trying to reposition itself, the Air Force as well. I think we're headed in the right direction. But we have to make intelligent purchases and put in place the right acquisition strategy to do that, to get where we need to be, to have the best information systems to be able to protect them, and then ideally be able to make vulnerable the information systems of our adversaries. And there's a lot we can learn from what the Russians have been up to, including their overall information campaign or disinformation campaign, their effort to tear down representative government in the West in general through a series of very low-cost options that are advancing their agenda. We need to really get in that game. So I'm very curious as you watch and see what Russia has been doing in those instances that I mentioned, also in the fight that's been going on in Armenia and Azerbaijan, a lot of this played out as well. What does that mean for what we ought to be buying, for what we ought to be providing you to make sure that you can meet your requirements? So very curious to hear about that. With that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Rogers for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. European Command and our NATO allies are facing an increasingly belligerent Russia and a growing Chinese influence in their operations. Russia continues to modernize, investing in hypersonic strategic capabilities and information warfare. Russia is also rebuilding its Arctic presence to control emerging areas of resource exploitation and commerce. And they're turning to new tactics to achieve their goals, employing aggression below the level of armed conflict. These new capabilities and tactics are designed to deter the United States and our allies from defending democracies on Russia's periphery. From the Black Sea to the Baltics, President Putin abhors the notion of former Soviet territories charting their own course as free and democratic nations. I believe the committee should continue its strong support for European Deterrence Initiative, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and other programs to build our capacity in Europe and empower our partners. Where we can, it also makes sense to equip our allies and partners with lethal weapon systems and domain awareness capabilities. Investments in critical facilities, pre-positioned munition stockpiles, and rotational forces keep our deterrent capabilities credible. Every capability we build in a partner nation strengthens our ability to chart a course away from Russian intimidation. We should be more concerned about raising the baseline of our partners' capabilities in Eastern Europe than about Vladimir Putin's ego. The flat truth is that he and his cronies won't be happy until they reclaim a portion of the Soviet Union's territorial glory. No amount of hand-wringing here in Washington will appease them. We owe our allies and partners nothing less than our full and forceful support. That being said, we should also be candid with our allies as we are with our enemies. Projects like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and NATO member purchases of Russian military hardware amount to a huge economic, political, and propaganda victories for Putin. Our allies shouldn't be in the business of strengthening our adversaries. We should use a whole-of-government approach to address these issues before they become diplomatic pressure points. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we can use diplomatic and military efforts to counter China's global ambitions in Europe. European nations are coming around to the threat of Chinese malign investment, hacking, and influence operations in their own backyard. We can use this opportunity to blunt China's advance, promote secure supply chains, and counter Chinese propaganda. European Command covers many of our most robust and long-standing international alliances. It also is responsible to assist in the defense of Israel, our steadfast ally. To overcome the modern threat posed by Russia and China and to ensure the protection of Israel, we need to provide the resources necessary to strengthen these alliances. Unfortunately, the budget proposed by President Biden will not do that. It cuts defense spending below the rate of inflation. If enacted, it will mean combatant commands like General Walters will not have the resources and capabilities they need to do their jobs. I look forward to working with the majority to pass a defense budget that supports modernization and ensures credible deterrence. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on policy matters related to the U.S. European Command, or EUCOM, area of responsibility in my capacity overseeing the Office of International Security Affairs today. It truly is a privilege to appear before you, and I would like to express my appreciation for the continued support from Congress and this committee in particular in shaping and resourcing the department's efforts in this region. It is also absolutely an honor to appear beside General Walters, an outstanding partner. Today, I will highlight the most important foundation of all Department of Defense efforts in this theater, our alliances. Then I will describe our strategic approach to Europe, the importance of NATO, and capability issues of note, followed by a brief discussion of regional threats and challenges. But first, I would like to briefly address two immediate issues of concern: escalating Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine and the President's decision to impose measures that will hold Russia accountable for its pattern of malign behavior. The United States is increasingly concerned about Russia's military buildup of forces along Ukraine's border and in occupied Crimea. Russia now has more troops on the border with Ukraine than at any time since 2014. The United States remains unwavering in its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. As such, we will continue to support Ukraine's long-term defense capacity and provide security assistance to enable Ukraine to more effectively defend itself against Russian aggression. We have also made clear in our engagement with Moscow that Russia needs to refrain from further escalatory actions. Additionally, this morning, the United States informed the Russian government of its intent to hold Russia accountable for a pattern of malign behavior that includes efforts to influence the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR's compromise of solar wind software, and the Main Intelligence Directorate, or GRU, efforts to encourage attacks on U.S. and coalition personnel in Afghanistan. The President is taking hard and fast action with appropriately tailored responses to provide a clear signal of our resolve without escalation. And I would welcome further discussion on these matters with this committee today. Russia's aggression in Eastern Ukraine and its pattern of destabilizing behavior are examples of the increasingly challenging international security situation. To compete in this new landscape, the Department of Defense is heeding the call of the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance and engaging our transatlantic friends with renewed vigor, reclaiming our place in international institutions, and revitalizing America's unmatched network of allies and partners. As President Biden and Secretary Austin have stated on numerous occasions, the U.S. commitment to NATO remains ironclad, and the transatlantic alliance remains the foundation on which our collective security and our shared prosperity are built. To ensure NATO's deterrence and defense posture is fit to purpose to meet the security challenges of the alliance, the Department will continue to work with allies to reinvigorate and modernize the alliance, share responsibilities and investments equitably, increase allied speed of decision-making, and improve military mobility across Europe to improve collective readiness. We are encouraged that we are now in our 7th year of steady NATO defense spending increases by our allies. We expect this trend to continue, and we continue to encourage strongly our NATO allies to increase their defense budgets. NATO's commitment to deterring nuclear attack remains a backstop of transatlantic security. As Secretary Austin has stated, nuclear weapons should remain in NATO countries for as long as nuclear weapons remain a threat. Deterrence also requires combat-credible, forward-deployed conventional forces to bolster the alliance's deterrence and defense posture to prevent Russian aggression. To this end, the Secretary of Defense is conducting a comprehensive department-wide global posture review to best align U.S. overseas force presence with presidential national security priorities. In this increasingly competitive environment, our security remains grounded in a whole, free, and at peace Europe, built upon a credible and strong NATO alliance. The department is also working to improve the resilience of another frontline state in the face of Russian aggression, Georgia. The United States remains committed to assisting Georgia build its resilience and military capabilities in the face of Russia's malign efforts to undermine its sovereignty and disrupt its Euro-Atlantic integration. Poland and the Baltics remain central to deterring Russia. The department is bolstering NATO's eastern flank allies through security cooperation and capacity building initiatives targeted at improving defense and security infrastructure to strengthen national resilience. In Poland, the department has increased its rotational presence to include the newly established 5th Corps Forward Command Post and a planned Aegis Ashore facility. In the Baltics, rotational forces supporting Atlantic Resolve continue to be a departmental priority. We continue to review our force posture to compete, deter, and defend against Russian aggression and assertiveness in the Black Sea region, and welcome the support of our NATO allies through their contributions not just to enhanced forward presence in the Baltic Sea region, but also tailored forward presence in the Black Sea region, as well as their respective air policing missions. In the Balkans, the department continues to strengthen our history of investment in the region, which includes now some of NATO's newest member states. The U.S. presence in NATO's Kosovo force helps maintain a safe and secure environment in the Balkans. In Southern Europe, our presence provides a counterbalance to growing Chinese and Russian influence, whose efforts also in Africa and the Mediterranean have implications for our strategic access and freedom of movement. While Turkey remains an important ally buttressing NATO's southern flank, the United States has been clear in opposing Turkey's procurement of the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft weapons system. Turkey's procurement of the S-400 prompted its removal from the F-35 program, and we continue to press Turkey to remove the S-400 from its arsenal. Israel is a major strategic partner for the United States. On January 15th, the United States announced that U.S. Central Command will assume responsibility for military-to-military cooperation with Israel. This will open up additional opportunities for cooperation with our U.S. CENTCOM partners while maintaining strong cooperation between Israel and our European allies and partners. We will continue to work with EUCOM and CENTCOM to ensure a thorough and deliberate transfer of authority. In conclusion, our objective is to ensure our broad and deep network of alliances and partnerships endures. The United States must continue to take an active role in the region by maintaining a ready and capable force, investing in NATO, and promoting a network of like-minded allies and partners. This work is only possible with consistent congressional backing and stable funding. Your support for our allies and partners in Europe and for Israel is indispensable. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I appreciate your continued support to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, Guardians, and civilians in the Department of Defense who work every day in service of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. General Walters.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of the men, women, and families who serve our nation in the Euro-Atlantic, we extend our heartfelt thanks for your steadfast support. It remains a privilege to serve alongside these dedicated patriots and our like-minded allies and partners. It's also great to be seated with Deputy Assistant Secretary Laura Cooper, a dedicated professional with strong ties to our valued European partners. She's been pivotal to generating peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. As we enter into the second year of the pandemic, we work closely alongside our allies and partners to ensure this health crisis does not transform into a security crisis. We'd also like to pass our condolences to those impacted by COVID-19. The battle against the virus continues, and we must remain vigilant. We're fully aligned with Secretary Austin's priorities to defend the nation, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork. Via NATO, we work closely with our allies and partners to address the evolving challenges posed by our adversaries to secure peace and protect our interests abroad. NATO remains the strategic center of gravity and the foundation of deterrence and assurance in Europe. Everything we do is about generating peace. We compete to win. We deter, and if deterrence fails, we're prepared to respond to aggression with the full weight of the transatlantic alliance. The United States' relationship with European allies and partners remains a key strategic advantage, and we must defend it. We live in an increasingly complex and contested world. Political uncertainty, energy competition, and diffusion of disruptive technology are stressing the established rules-based international order. Threats and challengers seek to take advantage of these conditions through aggressive actions using all instruments of national power, and they're backed by increasingly capable military forces. Adversaries amplify these malign activities and foster instability with disinformation. Success in 21st century warfare demands we embrace competition and all of its associated activities below the level of armed conflict. This is actually as critical as preparations for crisis or conflict themselves. We're in an era of strategic competition, and winning in this era is all about ensuring that strategic competition does not morph into a global conflict. One notable example of operations, activities, and investments contributing to competition and deterrence is our robust EUCOM exercise program. This summer, when we execute our Defender Series exercises, composed of U.S. EUCOM's Defender Europe and NATO's Steadfast Defender, 30,000 U.S. service members, allies, and partners from all warfare domains will demonstrate their ability to lift and shift massive forces over large swaths of territory at speed and at scale from the eastern periphery of the European continent. And once on station, they'll sharpen their responsiveness, resiliency, and lethality. Our current security posture is strong, yet challenged, as evidenced with respect to the activities in Ukraine. We possess combat-credible capability across all domains: air, land, sea, space, and cyber. We will maintain and work to hone this capability to deter our adversaries and defensive partners in our interest. The soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of U.S. EUCOM appreciate your support to defend the homeland forward and preserve peace for the 1 billion citizens living in the Euro-Atlantic. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. Could both of you talk a little bit about the information operations issue in Europe? We know Russia has been very aggressive about spreading their message, which is basically to undermine the West, undermine NATO, undermine democracies, sow discord, and they've been very effective at it. And I know for a number of years now we have been looking at responding to that. I know the combatant commanders have been concerned about it. How are we doing on beginning to get into that fight and counter what Russia is doing, get our own message out? And I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Chairman, if I could, with the assistance of this committee, we were able to kick off with SOCOM, our Special Operations Command Combatant Commander Operation Influence Platform. And underneath that architecture is what's called WebOps, and it's specifically designed to go after disinformation. And it's now a funded program with milestones set for future years.
And sorry to interrupt, but what's our message? I just described what Russia's message is, but what's ours?
Promote democratic values and tell the truth. And when disinformation is on the streets, highlight it.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper?
All right. I would point to the election, the 2020 election, as an example of Russia's aggressive disinformation efforts to divide and sow confusion and chaos in another population. It's a tactic that they've used in other places in the world around Europe, and it hit home here in 2020, but we also saw it in our previous election. And at the national level, we are working to deter such actions in the future and to impose costs on Russia. And that is why today, actually, the Biden administration announced a number of sanctions on specific actors within Russia that were involved in election interference.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, General. What capabilities are you currently lacking in EUCOM that you've asked for in the past, and why are they important?
Congressman, the two biggest have to do with improving our overall strategic indications and warnings and command and control. It starts with 2 destroyers to improve our ability to see undersea, and it also culminates with F-35s. Both are forecasts to arrive on continent very soon. We anticipate receiving the first set of U.S. F-35s in the fall of '21, and we're programmed now with the United States Navy in the 25 and 26 timeframe to hopefully receive 2 additional destroyers.
As we do our pivot to Indo-PACOM, do you see any resources or capabilities that you currently have being moved into that shift that would put you at a disadvantage?
No, sir, not at this time.
Great. Are you happy with the progress of pre-positioning capabilities and supplies in Eastern Europe, and do you need any additional pre-positioning, and if so, where?
Congressman, I'm very happy, and we're on course on glide slope to close all of our Army pre-positioned stockpiles and our deployable air-based system to support aerial ports in the '24 timeframe. And with this committee's assistance with the European Deterrence Initiative, if funding continues as forecast, we should make it.
And we talked yesterday about your interest in having some additional pre-positioning in the southeastern part of Europe. Where in particular would you like to see that?
Absolutely, Congressman. In the Romania area, we've put European Deterrence Initiative funds to improve infrastructure in those areas, and we've had great cooperation from Romania, and they also have the available ranges in multiple domains to be able to sharpen our readiness.
You know, we've heard that both of you comment about the buildup of troops by Russia on the Ukrainian border. How can we improve our international partnerships in support of Ukraine and help our NATO partners recognize that they need to be prepared to help us act in the event of aggression?
Congressman, it just goes back to the information ops that was pointed out by the chairman. We have to continue to tell the truth. And the good news is, as a result of this committee's support, we have a multinational joint commission in Ukraine that's assisting us with that. And we need to continue to support the Joint Military Training Group Ukraine, where we can put troops in country with military training team to allow the Ukrainian armed forces to improve their readiness. And that is ongoing.
Yeah. Ms. Cooper, in that same vein, you know, you made reference to the fact that we've been pleased to see our NATO partners moving toward 2% for those who haven't made it so far, but we still have others like very healthy economies like Germany who have not reached that threshold. Can you tell me what, if anything, the administration is doing to encourage them to continue on that path and not backslide?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say this is a consistent feature of our dialogue with all of the NATO member states, but in particular those who have yet to meet their Wales commitment. So this is something that came up as recently as the Defense Ministerial that Secretary Austin attended. This was a theme, and it also is something that we raise in our bilateral conversations.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And moving on here, we have a 5-minute limit going forward, and a lot of times you will be in the middle of answering a question when that 5-minute limit hits, and I feel rude cutting you off, but nonetheless, I will do it because we want to get to as many members as possible. So if you see that clock ticking down to 5 minutes, if you could wrap up your answers, that would be great. And with that, I yield to Mr. Langevin for 5 minutes. Jim, are you with us? Well, sir, we don't see him, so Larson. Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To start, thanks for seeing us today. To start, Jerry Conley, Representative Conley from Virginia, has a bill, H.R. 922. It's the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, and he's also the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Purpose of this act is basically say no federal agency in the U.S. government can say explicitly, implicitly, anything that would imply a recognition of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea by Russians. It's certainly, I support it, and I'd ask the committee members to support it, but I do want to use that as an intro to ask about Ukraine. The Russians see Crimea as an annexation. We don't. The eastern oblasts are still within Ukraine, and they're seen as separatists. Are we treating them differently, or approaching those two areas of Ukraine differently? And if so, how can we help you support those approaches?
Congressman, I would say the nature of the on-the-ground environment in both locations is different. In eastern Ukraine, you actually have a hot war right now. Within the past, since January, we've already had 30 Ukrainian service members killed in the east, whereas Crimea is an illegal occupation. And so there's some realities on the ground that are different. A lot of our train and equip efforts are directed at improving the capacity of Ukrainian armed forces to defend against the active war in the east. But in terms of overall policy, it absolutely is U.S. policy to reject this illegal annexation of Ukraine and to continue to impose sanctions on Russia as long as they hold this. In fact, there were just a number of additional sanctions imposed today on the Russian government, to include the builders of the Kerch Strait Bridge, which you may be familiar with, for Russia's continued occupation of Crimea.
Yeah, General?
Congressman, it's a great question, and having had the opportunity to visit from Kyiv down to the Donbass area, just as you pointed out, the tone and tenor of soldiers in the vicinity of Kyiv 2 years ago was a little bit different as you got further towards the southeast. But it's been my observation for the last 2 years, as a result of good work on behalf of the Multinational Joint Commission, that attitude to support the whole of government approach on behalf of Ukraine is improving the farther you get to the southeast. So there's a changing environment, as evidenced by the comments from President Zelensky as he continues to look west and talk about accessions to NATO.
Yeah, great. I want to make a pitch here. We cannot yet do CODELs. Our leadership and the DoD is not yet allowing that. Let me ask you this. Have you thought through how we could do COVID-19 socially distant appropriate CODELs to the UCOM region? And have you provided that advice yet to the Secretary so we can break that loose?
We will, Congressman, and we very much want the CODELs back, and we actually have a program of actionable milestones that talks about our proposal of when and where. We will get after that soonest.
That's excellent. We need to, I do know that parliamentarians, especially NATO parliamentarians, would like to see us again, if only to yell at us in person. But we'd like to return the favor sometimes as well. I'll just make a note and then yield that the Washington State National Guard now, I think, is headed to Western Ukraine, or in Western Ukraine as part of the training mission, and it's another reason why it's important. I know other state and national guards are in the Balkans, just in terms of our presence, to send that message to Russia that we care about Europe as much as Russia cares about Europe is important. So I'll just leave it at that, and with that, yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Turner is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, you and I had an opportunity before the hearing began to talk about the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Many of us are hearing from both service members and family members that are very concerned about service members and their dependents who are deployed overseas. The word we're getting is that there's been insufficient planning for the storage and transportation of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. In many of our states, we're doing very well. Ohio's down to age 16 and above, but yet in many of the areas, our service members that are actually deployed in areas where COVID is a greater threat than it is in some of our home states are not having adequate access to the vaccine. Some areas have been provided the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but of course there has now been a pause as a result of CDC recommendations. What can you tell us as to how this can be resolved? And obviously, Johnson & Johnson was a later approval. So the infrastructure and deployment for an ability to vaccinate our service members should have been undertaken well before Johnson & Johnson was even approved. To give us some assurance that the people that we care about, that are every day serving their nation, are going to be taken care of.
Congressman, I couldn't agree more. And big DOD in CONUS has recognized this issue, and combatant commanders, specifically myself and Phil Davidson from Indo-PACOM, have both expressed to the Secretary the need to accelerate the flow of vaccines, mostly for the dependents of our military members in Europe and for Phil Davidson in the Pacific. And up to this point, we've probably been a little bit off balance. Secretary Austin was key to point out the percentage of those Tier 1 military uniform members that have received the vaccine in CONUS should be equivalent to the same in Europe and the Pacific, and the same for the dependents. That has not been the case, so we're working to fix that. As we speak, Congressman, we are transitioning in Europe from receiving 3,500 vaccines a week to be able to receive 18,000 vaccines a week and be able to store them and administer them with a surge capacity to 23,000. Unfortunately, with the J&J cutoff, there's probably going to be about a 20% reduction to those surges, and we're still working on the specifics. But the site picture from within Europe for the military members and certainly for the dependents will be significantly different by the end of May than it is today, because we will actually triple our surge capacity. We have the storage capability, we have the medical treatment facilities, and the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who can administer the vaccines. And my biggest concern is not necessarily the Tier 1 military, but to get to the dependents soonest.
Well, General, that doesn't provide me comfort, by the way, that you don't say Tier 1 military. I mean, our service members need to be covered. And again, we knew this was coming. I mean, the federal government has been very active in the acquisition and distribution of vaccines. And so I appreciate your words, but I certainly hope that this is addressed, because this impacts people's real lives and, of course, the concerns of their families. Shifting to the F-35, you mentioned it in your statements, and when the ranking member was asking you about what else do you need in forward deployed, we now have the United Kingdom, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Norway. Poland is apparently looking into entering the F-35. Italy, Finland, of course, we currently have the ongoing competition. Putin is going to be looking at a whole different world as we begin to deploy the F-35 and our allies begin fielding it. It is, of course, the plane that is going to be necessary to keep, as you referenced, deterrence, because it is the dual-capable portion of our mission. Tell us about the F-35 and its importance in Europe.
Congressman, the F-35 contributes to campaign momentum strategically for indications and warnings, command and control, and obviously lethality. We have 81 total in Europe right now that our NATO allies and partners are using. We're programmed to get our first 2. It gives us access to be able to deter effectively anywhere on the European continent, and if called upon to conduct interdiction, it allows us to put any target at risk, plus or minus a millisecond, with great accuracy, and allowing for access to do the same.
How are allies reporting the plane?
They're incredibly excited and incredibly happy with its performance.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. One other announcement I should have made. We have a classified version of this hearing at 2 o'clock over in the CVC. So in order to give people a little bit of a break in between, we are going to end this portion at 1:20. So we'll go until then, get as many members as we can, and then break and reconvene at 2 o'clock in the CVC for the classified portion. With that, Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for the testimony today. I want to turn my attention to UAVs and the threats they pose because of swarming capabilities. In particular, I want to focus on the lessons we've learned from the recent Nagorno-Karabakh war. We saw Azerbaijan use unmanned systems not as standalone weapons, but as part of complex synchronized attacks against air defense networks and conventional units. Given the successful unmanned swarm that attacked Saudi Arabia in 2019, this isn't the first time that we've seen this. So, General Walters, how would our current integrated air defense system stand up in a similar situation, and who has the cost advantage?
Congressman, we have designated the United States Army to be the lead DoD entity for counter-small UAS. More importantly, in Europe, we have to ensure that from a indications and warning standpoint, our integrated air and missile defense programs take into account the capabilities of these systems. They do. It's not good enough. We have to continue to improve. It's a program that's funded. We know what the requirements are. But more importantly for me as a U.S. EUCOM commander, it's an issue that many of our NATO allies and partners have the capability to deter against, and strategically our new strategies and our plans all take into account in forcing our NATO allies and partners to improve in this area.
As a follow-up, how would incorporating emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and directed energy improve our responses to asymmetric and near-peer threats?
Enormous help. It allows us to see the battle space earlier. It allows us to approach and neutralize a target at greater range with greater speed. So those are all very helpful.
Thank you. Next, Russia aggressively invests in electronic warfare capabilities that are specifically geared toward negating our technological advantages, which is successfully deployed, just by way of example, in Ukraine and Syria. General, what is your command doing to make your systems more resilient in a communications degraded or denied environment? And more importantly, how are you training your personnel to operate in this environment?
We feel reasonably comfortable, Congressman, with the gear that we have in place. The biggest area is to ensure that the training keeps pace with the adversaries' EWTTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And my assessment in EUCOM is that we're in pretty good shape. We pay close attention to advancing EW technologies that Russia utilizes. We're able to witness some of that in the battle space that you're familiar with in the environment in the vicinity of Syria, and we'll continue to improve. But for us, it's critical that when it comes to EW, you have to have very good indications and warnings, and you have to have very protected command and control architecture, which we are working towards.
You know, it's essential to make sure that we're paying close attention to that, so that our enemies and adversaries can't use that asymmetric advantage or capability against us. Let me just turn to something else. The ability to quickly attribute a cyber attack and respond to a coalition of partner nations is one of our most effective tools in deterring Russian cyber actions. Right now, our response speed has been in months and years, which is unacceptable. It's too slow. Ms. Cooper, what is your information sharing relationship with the State Department regarding cyber attribution, and how could we improve it to more effectively respond?
Congressman, thank you. If I understood the question correctly, it relates to working in a whole of government context on Russia cyber attribution. Is that correct, sir?
To shorten the window for attribution, too.
I see.
Identifying and then responding.
I see. Thank you,
more quickly.
Sir. On this, I can say we've actually come a long way. We still have a ways to go. Today, we are attributing formally the SolarWinds cyber intrusion to Russia's SVR, their Foreign Intelligence Service. That represents a public attribution that we are making in coordination with allies and partners who have also been affected by SolarWinds. And this is something that we initially were focused on in the past few months. Obviously, we have to get this down to days, not just months. But we're also working on the process of quick release.
And I do
declassification.
apologize, but the gentleman's time has expired. If there's further follow-up there, you can take it for the record and send it to Mr. Langerman. Mr. Lamborn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask you both about lethal aid to Ukraine. In recent years, Congress and this committee included has authorized that. It was way overdue, in my opinion, but I'm glad we're finally doing it. General Walters, how has lethal aid that we have provided to Ukraine helped ensure their security vis-a-vis Russia?
Congressman, thanks for the question. It goes back to that military trust factor. When a fellow soldier shows up with gear that actually convinces the Ukrainian Armed Force military members that this will be effective against an enemy to protect our sovereignty, whether it's lethal or non-lethal. But when they can see both, it's a plus. And as you well know, with the assistance of this committee, since 2017, the Javelin has been a very productive program. We've got approximately 360 missiles and a fair amount of launchers in storage. And today, Ukrainian soldiers know exactly how to grab those Javelins out of the storage site, get to the foxhole, and if called upon to use that munition to defend themselves, they have the confidence that they can do this. Not only do we supply the munitions, but we rotate military training teams in to make sure that their proficiency is where it needs to be. And when I addressed earlier the mental disposition of the Ukrainian armed forces as you work from Kyiv up in the northwest portion of Ukraine down towards the Donbass, that improvement in attitude of the soldiers is partly due to this increase in trust on behalf of these contributions.
Excellent. Ms. Cooper, what is your view?
Congressman, we're very proud to be able to provide defensive lethal assistance. And in addition to the Javelin capability that General Walters mentioned, I think it's very important that we have expanded our assistance to not just focus on the land domain, but also the maritime domain. So that means that the patrol boats that we're providing will have defensive lethal capability on them.
And are there additional steps that we should take? I don't know if that is actually materialized yet or not. If not, we'd like to help. I'd like to help assist in that regard. Are there additional steps that have not yet materialized that you would like to see?
Sir, from an authorities perspective, I think we have the right authorities, and we have been able to provide the right lethal assistance, again, both on the land domain and the maritime domain at this point, and we appreciate the support of the committee.
General Walters, anything to add to that?
Congressman, I think we're in good shape as we look at what DOD is doing right now with the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. Those funds are looking to be targeted directly in these areas, and I don't see any obstacles at this point.
Okay, thank you. And General Walters, changing subjects, how would you characterize the NATO support for the ongoing modernization of our nuclear enterprise, the nuclear triad, which each of those three legs are getting upgrades in different ways? How does NATO view that, our NATO allies?
It's improving, Congressman. We actually, for the first time in 67 years, produced a NATO military strategy and a concept for the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. And we approached NATO with the opportunity to actually address this subject. It was well received, and as we speak, we've had many participants come into our NAC, North Atlantic Council, and entertain discussions on the nuclear enterprise and what we're actually doing. So the campaign momentum is in the right direction, and we now actually have plans that are being codified that address the value of a triad and what it does for strategic deterrence.
Ms. Cooper, would you have anything to add to that?
Nothing to add. Thank you, Congressman.
Okay, and General Walters, I would have to think that when the 30 or so countries that are under our nuclear umbrella see us modernizing, that gives them a lot of reassurance.
Yes, Congressman.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, you alluded to one of your top needs to have 2 destroyers, and you cited the sort of undersea work that they would do. Can you talk about that in a little more detail?
Yes, Congressman. For the last 3 years, we've seen an increase in undersea activity on behalf of Russia in the vicinity of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And I would adore the opportunity to talk more to this in a different setting. But what I can say is a consistent increase in activity. And the destroyer's participation in the undersea warfare C2 and INW is absolutely positively critical. And as you well know, we have 4 of those in Europe. and they are the workhorses of deterrence, extending all the way into the Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, all the way back around the Mediterranean, all the way up into the Arctic and the Barents. And as we've continued to do the math, for basic needs to cover down adequately, we believe that 2 more is what is required.
Well, thank you. Again, before COVID, a number of us did a CODEL to sort of focus on anti-submarine warfare. We actually visited Keflavik Air Base up in Iceland, which the Bush administration had closed in the wake of the Cold War coming to an end, air quotes, and now it's been reopened for P-8 flights. Admiral Gary Ruffhead, the former CNO, used to testify before this committee that the best anti-submarine warfare platform is another submarine. Can you talk about, again, some of the work that, again, our submarine force is doing in that arena?
So I certainly agree with Admiral Ruffhead's conclusion, because he certainly knows best. And I contend that our submarine fleet is performing admirably, but part of the command and control apparatus that is involved in this process involves other assets, to include maritime patrol aircraft like the P-8, as well as what a destroyer does. So to comprehensively defend in this area, from undersea all the way to 25,000 feet with a P-8, we need to make sure that we have the right hardware and software involved, and we're traversing in that direction, and our subforce is performing admirably, but it's very challenging with respect to numbers.
Right, and I thank you, and I think General Scaparrotti, your predecessor, described it as we're sort of playing zone defense as opposed to man-to-man, but we could probably get into that more in the classified setting. When we talk about Russia's sort of malign activities, obviously the maritime domain, we saw it in the Ukraine where they seized the 3 ships in international waters. The UN Convention just unanimously reprimanded that action. We've had other combatant commanders before this committee in recent weeks, and I've asked them all about whether or not you think, given the fact that we're in sort of a new era, whether it's Indo-Pacific or in the European theater, where countries, Russia and China, are trying to exercise maritime control, which really goes up against the I think, norm of freedom of navigation, which has been basically the rule of the road since World War II. General, and I'm going to ask Ms. Cooper as well, I mean, do you support, like your colleagues who testified, that the U.S. should become a full participant in the UN Convention on Law of the Sea?
Yes, Congressman.
Ms. Cooper?
I would just say that the administration has not issued a formal review of this or opinion on this yet, so I have to defer the question to General Walter's military advice.
Great. Well, again, we're, just so you know, in the House, even though we don't get to vote on that, we will have a bipartisan resolution with myself and Congressman Young from Alaska calling on the Senate to really, again, the world has been changing in the maritime sphere, and not being able to be an active party or even observer, which we found out in the Philippines challenge to South China Sea, is just, it's ridiculous. And we're in the company of, North Korea, Libya, Syria, in terms of not being full ratified participants in this process, which again worked in the case of Ukraine. The UN's decision actually ended up having Russia release those ships and those sailors. But again, it shows it has important value to this country, which is a maritime country. So I'll get off my soapbox and yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Walters, Ms. Cooper, thanks so much for joining us today. General Walters, I'm going to go to you and build upon the assertive efforts the United States has pursued in making sure that our NATO allies spend the 2% of their GDP on defense. I hope this administration continues what has been that assertive effort. But it's not only how much our allies spend, but it's how they spend it, to make sure that it's complementary to the assets within the theater, not things that are duplicative or things that don't add to our capacity to deter and defend within that particular region. One of the elements I think is incredibly important is to look at, how that's being done. Look at what's happening with Russia with those SNAP exercises. So are you seeing the spending by our allies there being complementary or duplicative? And are we generating the capacity to be able to surge and sustain, if necessary, just as the Russians practice in a way that I think is meant to send a message, but also lets us look at their ability to sustain also. So I want to get your perspective on that.
Congressman, I would say that the transparency and alignment of our expenditures across the 30 nations is improving.
Okay.
And we started by redoing a strategy that is geared towards the 21st century, that is more whole of government, whole of nation, to include military contributions that takes into account all domain awareness and winning in competition, not waiting for crisis or conflict to win, but win in competition. So with all this in mind, the new strategy has allowed us to go back and develop new strategic plans, and those plans ultimately call for requirements to deliver the appropriate competition effect in a particular area, and it allows nations to establish military requirements to go after what is needed. And that architecture has proven very, very worthy. And the recent decision by the United Kingdom with respect to producing their military strategy, and what we've also done in the U.S. is an example of better transparency and alignment from the plans to requirement standpoint to make sure that we can generate more peace in Europe.
Very good. Thank you, General Walters. Let me switch gears a little bit and point to the political crisis that began in 2014 in Ukraine that sparked a war that continues today. Ms. Cooper, you pointed to the number of casualties that are there today. On that track, casualties will exceed in 2021 what occurred in 2020. I think all those things are incredibly concerning. Another thing that's very concerning is to watch what's happening with the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And you see what they are doing within that area and the capability that they are building. Modernization efforts there, I think, are very alarming, especially with the warm water access that they have through the Black Sea now. That creates a strategic challenge for the United States in many other ways. Do you see that the modernization effort for the Black Sea Fleet is disproportional to other Russian modernization efforts? Do you see that as being a strategic challenge for us with them building that particular capability there? And do you believe that them taking Crimea and claiming that now gives them a strategic foothold in that area that helps them in that effort to modernize the Black Sea Fleet and to extend influence and create threats and uncertainty outside of that area to the United States?
Congressman, I see a concerted effort on behalf of Russia's maritime forces in the Baltics, in the Barents, and in the Black Sea. In all three of those areas, fairly comprehensive and fairly equal. And I certainly agree with you. Our vigilance is sky high in all those areas from a military maritime perspective. And every point that you alluded to with respect to potential intentions, we are preparing for and planning for and expecting it to occur.
Very good. Ms. Cooper, any thoughts on that?
Congressman, I appreciate the question. On the Black Sea, I would say that this is an area of increased policy focus, and we're taking an approach that looks holistically at all of our allies and partners in the region. We've started with efforts to build maritime domain awareness capacity. This is in Ukraine, Georgia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And I already earlier referenced some of the maritime capabilities that we're supporting the government of Ukraine with.
Very good. Thank you. Quick question. I know I only have a few seconds left. Choke point, the Turkish Straits, there at the Black Sea, Turkey being a NATO ally, the unfortunate greater alignment now, it seems like, with Russia than the United States. Is that a long-term issue for us in how we deal with Turkey and also with them as a NATO ally?
And sadly, that one will have to be taken for the record or come later. Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Spear is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your leadership. Ms. Cooper, I want to thank you for always being available to talk with me and others about many of the issues we have in the region. I'd like to talk to you today about the large-scale offensive that Azerbaijan engaged in against its neighbor Armenia with the coordination of Turkey over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. It caused more than 5,000 deaths, displaced roughly 100,000 people from their homes, and caused immeasurable suffering. Azerbaijan continues to hold over 200 Armenian prisoners of war. And there's been abuse and mistreatment that's truly shocking. The U.S. provided $100 million to Azerbaijan in violation, really in defiance of nearly 2 decades parity in the U.S. security assistance to Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think we're sending a terrible message to Armenia, and because we did not engage in terms of getting the parties to the Minsk group table for negotiations, Russia stepped in and now has yet another foothold in that region. And you mentioned in your earlier comments how critical it was for us to engage in there. So my question to you is that are you clear now of the relevance of maintaining parity between the two countries in terms of aid? And what are we going to do in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to all those who've been displaced?
Congresswoman, thank you so much for raising this important issue set. The war this fall was a tragedy on so many levels, and we deplore the loss of life. We have spent a lot of time trying to, back then, de-escalate the situation, and now continuing to talk with Azerbaijan and Armenia about what we can achieve in a peaceful way forward. In terms of our, also in terms of the aftermath of the conflict, we have been urging Azerbaijan specifically to release the detainees. This has been a line that not just my State Department colleagues have offered, but also Defense Department, myself included. In terms of the paradigm for our assistance, we want to have very strong and stabilizing relationships with all of the countries in the region, with Armenia, with Georgia, and with Azerbaijan. We believe that we can exert a positive influence on all 3 countries. In terms of Azerbaijan specifically, our assistance has really been focused on areas that are important to U.S. national security. It's been focused on the Coast Guard domain, so Caspian Sea security.
I understand that, but in the end, it allows them money that they can then use, as they did, against Armenia. So I just think we've got to look long and hard at their conduct and not be rewarding them for bad behavior moving forward. Let me move on to General Walters. Some organizations here in the United States, such as the Anti-Defamation League, have noticed an increasing connection between violent extremism, white supremacy groups in the United States, and groups in some of the European countries. We've looked at that in the Military Personnel Subcommittee as it relates to service members as well. So given this problem with extremism in some parts of the military, what steps are you taking to combat this problem in your unique position at UCOM?
Thank you, Congressman. It's an imperative that we continue to improve good order and discipline and treat each other with dignity and respect. And as we start down this path of embracing extremism for the duration of our military careers, and in U.S. UCOM, I was quick to point out to our commanders, extremism won't go away. And when you take the oath and you put on the cloth, it will be a responsibility of yours to be intrusive with respect to finding it, getting rid of it, and finding ways to communicate with others what tactics, techniques, and procedures need to go forward to rectify. So the one-day session that we had for feedback was very, very helpful. We've got a long ways to go. We're just to the start, but we're going to have to embrace this for the duration of our careers to fix it.
I encourage you to use the opportunity you have within the department to look at the social media of recruits before they enlist to make sure we're not augmenting the number of white supremacists within the military that already exists. And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. I'd like to cover questions about China and troop movements and Turkey, but I don't know if we'll have time for all of that. But I'll start off with General Walters. You know, there's no question that Russia is our #1 threat in Europe. They've shown time and again that they will invade a country and have malign influence. But while they're doing that, China also, it gives them an opportunity to expand their influence, their Belt and Road Initiative, their economic investment investments in the area. And I'm really would like to get your feedback on what you're hearing from our European allies. First of all, do they recognize the threat of China? And what are their steps or counter steps are they taking? Do you see and do they see that 5G is a concern? And are the European allies concerned about the growing expansion and partnership with Russia in Arctic and the Norwegian Sea? So a lot of questions there, but I'd appreciate your perspective.
Congresswoman, first, the awareness of malign influence with respect to 5G, with respect to seaports, with respect to economic interests with aerial ports is markedly improving. I would have told you a year ago with respect to China, my number one concern was proliferation of 5G. What has happened over the course of the last year, 5G with China, Huawei, and ZTE was spread into 15 separate nations. As a result of the UK's position with 5G to reverse course and no longer go with China, other nations have followed suit. As we speak, 8 of those 15 nations have enacted restrictions against Huawei 5G, and we're still working with the other 7. We're very concerned about the economic interests that China continues to display with respect to ports, and you're very familiar with the numbers with respect to what they do to impact shipping capacity. So today, our number one issue is a proliferation with China economic interests with seaports and aerial ports, and we're still concerned about 5G. But the awareness on behalf of the NATO nations and our partners is improving.
Great. Well, thank you for your work on that. For several years, I've been concerned about the ability of our troops to move throughout Europe. You talked about the exercise that we're going to conduct again this summer, but specifically dealing with railroad track gauge size differences. And when you enter the parts of the Baltic areas and everything that used to be controlled by the Soviet era, they're not compatible, and you have a stoppage of the movement of the equipment. So where are we at on that, and what do we need to do to get after that problem?
We're improving. My goal was to improve the speed of road and rail from central Germany to the Eastern European border with each passing day by at least a second. And that is certainly taking case in this committee's contributions with EDI have allowed us to improve infrastructure, to put pre-positioned stockpiles where they need to be, to take off some of the pressure with respect to demand signals on road and rail until we can get those fixed. We've set up a much better command architecture. In NATO, we established a three-star headquarters 2 years ago, the Joint Support Enabling Command. Their sole responsibility is to logistically cover down and tackle the number one strategic issue is move at speed in all domains from west to east. So we're making gains. Something that I have advocated for is the ability of the rail cars to be able to move and change very quickly when they get to that point, to move the actual wheels so that they can fit, rather than unloading everything onto. Is there some discussion of doing something like that? Germany has some wonderful solutions in that area, and they're moving out to enact that. We're still challenged a little bit with some of the other nations, but what we have today is a system in place that allows Estonia to have access to the same kind of tactics, techniques, and procedures and advances that Germany sees. So we'll gain quicker improvement. And very quickly, and I'll go to you, Ms. Cooper, Turkey, S-400. What is the Biden administration's policy with pushing back on Turkey in this realm, and what do you see can be done in relation to Turkey and NATO and all of our workings with them? Just in the interest of time, I'll briefly just say that we do see S-400 as incompatible with F-35, so they're out of the F-35 program. We have been urging Turkey to remove the S-400. That is a consistent point of diplomacy and in mill-to-mill conversations. But at the end of the day, they're a NATO ally, and so we still work with them as a NATO ally, and we value their contributions internationally, to include in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panelists for your presentations today and making yourselves available in your service to our country. General Walters, I'd like to ask you about infrastructure. The United States, EU, and NATO have been focused on European infrastructure over the last several years. Everything from the EU committing 1.5 billion euros for military mobility to streamlining cross-border movements, to adapting European transport networks for dual use to accommodate the military needs. Can you talk a little bit about your assessment about infrastructure to support military mobility, and also how you're using Defense Europe 21, the exercise that began last month, to assess and to continue prioritizing, perhaps reprioritizing the infrastructure needs?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the great question. We're able to take these large exercises, Congressman, and we can actually track a company and track a battalion. And when they hit the port in Bremerhaven, we can time how long it takes them to get to their foxholes on the eastern perimeter. And we look for improvements over time. And with this committee's great contributions with the European Deterrence Initiative, we've been able to get after that infrastructure, not only from a movement standpoint, but from a pre-positioned stockpile standpoint. And for Defender Europe 21, there's 4 major exercises. The actual last portion is a C2 exercise that looks back and examines how well we did in joint forcible entry, how well we did at integrated air and missile defense, and how well we were able to shoot, move, and communicate with Army force elements, specifically timing their speed to get to their foxholes. So it's an area of great concern to me. Strategically, I start with 2 initial concerns: speed and posture. And speed has a lot to do with the subject, sir, and we're making gains.
Thank you. And you're comfortable with the level of coordination with our allies on prioritizing that infrastructure needs?
I am, Congressman, and I'm also comfortable with our NATO allies and partners' willingness to take the lead in this area.
Thank you. My second question, on Tuesday, Secretary Austin was in Berlin, and he spoke to the expansion of our presence in Germany by 500 personnel. He went on to say that it's there to strengthen our deterrence and defense, and he identified space and cyber and electronic warfare capabilities as components of what those additional 500 personnel would bring. Can you speak to whether or not that 500 will be a permanent forward presence? Is it going to be a rotational presence? And maybe more broadly speak about the mix of rotational versus forward presence, and whether we've got the right balance today.
Congressman, I'll start with the latter first. As you will know, the mix is always it depends, SOFA agreements, type of domain, concerns for the service going forward. But right now, I'm convinced that we've got the right mix in the ground domain with 1 rotational armored brigade combat team. With respect to your first series of questions, that there are 2 elements to Secretary Austin's announcements. A multi-domain task force and a theater fires organization. And our plan for right now is for both of those to be permanently assigned forces at Wiesbaden in perpetuity.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, last month you moved us to WatchCon 1, which is potential imminent crisis. With regard to Ukraine, we saw NATO planes have to intercept as many as 10 Russian warplanes in a single day last March. And there are public reports. The word that is used is massive buildup of Russian troops and equipment near Crimea. Is massive the right word, in your opinion, to describe the buildup of Russian troops on the borders of Crimea?
Congressman, I would adore the opportunity to get to specific numbers, but what I can say is there is a very large ground domain force that has moved from the Western Military District and the Southern Military District to the vicinity of Crimea and the Donbass. There is a sizable Air Force, and there's also a notable maritime force that has shifted as well. It is of great concern.
And
Our vigilance is high.
And are they pushing the supply lines forward as well to supply those troops and the equipment that is moved into the area?
Sir, that activity is plateaued, and again, I would like to talk more in a different environment, but I can tell you, as of right now, that activity is plateaued.
Okay. I don't have any further questions, Mr. Chairman. General, as we get into the the classified briefing, my interest is in the number of NATO intercepts currently versus what they were over the last 6 to 12 months, as well as what the size of the force is that we see from Russia today versus where it was over the last several months, and then what we're seeing from our NATO allies as far as the lethal support for the Ukraine. And I realize that all of those will have to be done in a classified setting. So I will, out of respect for time, yield the remainder of my time so that other members can ask their questions, and look forward to those answers in a classified session.
All right, thank you. Mr. Keating is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to get to 3 questions. First one, just a quick follow-up, Ms. Cooper, on the Azerbaijan Armenia war that was a terrible war that occurred. But in my other capacity as chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction and Foreign Affairs, I'm working to reinforce position of engineering the release of those POWs that are there. And I just wanted to know how hopeful the prospects are for great peace and stability in the region.
Did you get enough? Sorry, Bill, you're breaking up a little bit. Did you get enough of that?
I believe so. If the question pertains to peace and stability in the Caucasus region, then I can answer that. Is that correct?
Yeah, specifically release of the POWs with Azerbaijan and Armenia in the wake of the terrible war that was there.
Okay.
And prospects for peace and stability. Can you hear? Am I breaking?
Yeah,
Yes,
we got
yes.
that. We got that. Thanks. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I would say the lead for the discussions on the release of the detainees is with the State Department, so I am less familiar with the day-to-day on that, and would probably defer to them for their overall assessment. I would say more broadly, I do have concerns about the peace and stability in the region. I do not see it as a positive development that at the end of this conflict, Russia now has 2,000 peacekeepers, or so-called peacekeepers, on Azerbaijan soil. They already have forces in Armenia, and of course, they illegally occupy sovereign Georgia in both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So to me, this is not a positive development. That said, we are kind of looking at how we can play a supporting role in the Defense Department to State Department-led efforts to have...
Okay. Thank you so much. I hate to interrupt, but I wanted to get to
Please.
Another question. The Wagner Group, I don't know if we touched on a lot of what's going on, but Prigozhin, his associates, he's been sanctioned, but his associates were sanctioned as part of our announcement today. Will this curtail or help curtail the Wagner Group activities, given his association with this? And in Europe, I know it's expanding in Syria and through Africa. What's the status of the use of the Wagner Group?
Did you?
Congressman, this is General Walters. I got the last portion. What I can say in this setting is what we witnessed from the Wagner Group starting 2 years ago has persisted in those geographical regions that you addressed.
Right. Again, just the last area, the importance of the European Deterrence Initiative. There were cuts made in that. And I don't think in my own discussions with people in Europe that was well received, although diplomatically they were very careful with what they said. What's the status of that, and would it require more funding and more support?
Congressman, this is General Walters. We've been very pleased with this committee's support for EDI. I don't know what exactly will unfold in 22, but I suspect the EDI portion will be reduced. And I will tell you that every single cent that is part of that EDI is incredibly important to improve our campaign momentum in indications and warnings, command and control, and mission command. So with any reduction, there are going to be challenges, but we certainly appreciate the funding that has been in place, and we hope it continues in the future.
Okay, it's an area of my concern, and I hope that we can fund that to a greater amount. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins is recognized for 5 minutes. Apologize, he was there until a second. Mr. Desjardins, can you hear me? You're up.
I can.
It is not our day for technology. We're not hearing.
Wait.
Yeah, you're buffering, which is not a good thing. Oh, wow. Oh, we just pretty much lost everybody. Mr. Gallagher, we'll go ahead and let you give a shot, and then we'll try to get folks back online here. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to, I guess, to put it bluntly, what's the likelihood of an invasion of Ukraine in the next few weeks?
Low to medium.
Say again?
Low to medium.
Low to medium? Thank you. I hope to follow up in classified session as well. Russia has an assortment of intermediate range missile systems, including the Iskander ballistic missile, which Jane's reports is currently being deployed along the Ukrainian border. Given this deployment and the Russian threat, just how important are long-range precision fires to your ability to deter aggression in Europe?
Tremendously important, and that multi-domain task force that Secretary Austin just talked about is a key step towards improving our ability to fire from ground to ground.
And how would programs like the Marine Corps' long-range precision fires program or the Army's Prsm system contribute to your operational flexibility as a combatant commander?
They're great contributions.
And what would be some of the potential future consequences if Congress were to refuse to provide you with such capability?
It would impact our campaign momentum from a lethality standpoint.
And sorry to keep beating this horse, but the budget summary released by the Biden administration last week specifically calls out long-range fires and finds, quote, the safety and security of the nation requires a strong, sustainable, and responsive mix of long-range strike capabilities. Do you agree?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Now I'll shift gears a little bit. Just last week, an anti-mining political party blocked a Chinese-backed firm's access to some of Greenland's massive rare earth deposits. Given the critical importance of rare earths to the U.S. defense supply chain, it would benefit us to pay greater attention to Greenland, its security, and adversary activity there. I'd just be curious to get your thoughts on the importance of Greenland.
Thank you, Congressman. We agree that Greenland is a very important location, and our conversations with the Kingdom of Denmark about the security of the broader region, to include Chinese investments and Chinese concerns in the region, have reflected that.
And going forward, how do you intend to continue to ensure the security of Greenland and its resources, given that our adversaries obviously recognize it's important economically? And where do you see Greenland's place in EUCOM's broader strategic picture? I don't know.
At the heart, Congressman, as you well know, Denmark never lets me forget about the equities that they represent in Greenland. And as we've developed that concept for deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, it specifically points out the comprehensive geographical approach that has to take place and identifies Greenland.
Thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by asking about Ukraine, just to follow on to Mr. Gallagher's comment. He had asked about the threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine in the next few weeks. You had characterized that as low to medium. General Walters and Ms. Cooper, would that assessment be higher if I were to ask that and say, what is the risk between now and the end of the year?
The answer is it depends, and I would have to take each and every second of the day from this point till tomorrow to give you a different answer. So I know that's not what you want to hear, but we continue to examine every single part of the environment in all domains to make sure that we.
Well, let me ask it this way. You were able to make an assessment based on him asking over the next couple of weeks. Based on the current trajectory and what we know now, does that threat continue to increase beyond the next 2 weeks?
It depends, Congressman, on the disposition of the forces. My sense is, with the trend that I see right now, that the likelihood of an occurrence will start to wane.
So when you say it depends, so you were able to make an assessment based on the next 2 weeks. You gave a concrete assessment, low to medium. So you are only able to give an assessment 2 weeks out. Is that what you're telling me?
In a different setting, I can give you a deeper assessment based off strategic aspects.
That's the answer I need then. We can follow up this afternoon. Ms. Cooper, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Congressman, no, other than to say we're watching this very closely at the highest levels.
Okay. Next question is, Mr. Bacon and I are co-chairs of the Military Resiliency and Energy Caucus, and we're very concerned about energy resiliency for our installations around the world. We've had a lot of discussions about the reliance of some of our installations on Russian gas. Can you just talk about the risk that reliance on that Russian fuel source poses to our installations in Germany in particular?
It's a high risk for those nations' militaries that rely on Russian gas. As you know, Congressman, in the U.S., we work very, very hard with our reserves to ensure that we, to the max extent practical, do not, as a U.S. DOD, rely on Russian gas.
But to our allies that we're integrated with, there is a high risk.
It is.
Okay. And last, General Walters, regarding Russia's involvement in the Arctic, I've spent a fair amount of time in Svalbard, actually, and have been to places like Barentsburg and others. Is it your characterization, I'd love Ms. Cooper maybe to start on this, that the Russians are pushing the boundaries of the Treaty of Svalbard to create logistical supply chains and facilities there to enhance their ability to project power into the Arctic?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say I can't give you a legal read of the treaty, but in general terms, we are concerned about what we see as Russia's attempts to control maritime traffic. And so this is something that has been the focus of our bilateral conversations with Russia, but also a topic of conversation among the Arctic powers, U.S. and our allies and partners.
General Walters.
I concur. What I will say, Congressman, is I'm pleased with the strategic architecture by the European nations to place greater focus in the vicinity of the Arctic for the precise reasons that Laura Cooper talked about.
Thank you. And General Walters, we were limited in our ability during Defender Europe to fully assess transportation ability and the ability to move forces because of the pandemic. What needs to be done going forward, I'd say the next year, in the near term, to address those capability gap assessments because of the limited nature of that exercise?
Great question, Congressman. We're going to have two large sample sizes, one from Defender Europe 20 that's already taken place. We're in the middle of it. We had to curtail some of our activity, but we did get a lot of lift and shift of massive forces. And then we'll take a sample of what takes place with Defender Europe 21 and be able to point out after a good constructive after-action review where some of our limfacts are. And we've got a red team assigned in all domains to be an inhibitor of advancement. So we're excited about the fact that we're placing a lot of emphasis in this area.
So it sounds like you're pretty confident. You have a plan in place to address those capability gaps and make those assessments over the next year.
Absolutely, and EDI is incredibly helpful for mitigation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I thank you both for your service to the country and for doing this important work, and look forward to the discussion in the closed session. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will give Mr. Desjardins another shot here. I believe we have the technical fixes. You are up, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Walters, could you just briefly explain the importance of our nuclear weapons capability and how it serves to reassure our allies in deterring these strategic non-nuclear attacks from adversaries like Russia?
Congressman, we've certainly had the nuclear triad in place as a strategic deterrence umbrella in Europe for well over 6 decades. And the prosperous peace that we've been able to enjoy is certainly attributed to that. So it's very important from that standpoint.
If the United States were to adopt a no first use policy, how do you believe this would be perceived or received by our allies?
Congressman, I think you would get a mixed return depending upon the allies' awareness of the nuclear enterprise. And I'm not equipped to give you a country-by-country return on that, but I think you'd get some mixed responses.
Okay. How do you feel about a no first use policy?
Congressman, I currently support the U.S. position on not adhering to the nuclear no first use policy in accordance with the Nuclear Posture Review of 2018.
If we were to adopt such a policy, do you believe that Russia in turn would restrict their own nuclear policy in any substantive way?
Congressman, I'm not sure what Russia would do, but I do know we would probably be in a position to where we wouldn't trust the decision that they make.
Okay. Well, I just have some concerns, and I hope the Biden administration is tuning into this hearing, because in the past, President Biden had expressed his support of a no first use policy, and I hope he would seriously rethink that position and look at what our allies would say. Granted, you said there was a mixed response. Let's turn to Israel for a minute. General, in your statement, you noted that the tremendous strides Israel has made under the Trump administration, normalizing relationships with the Arab world and improving regional security. Do you foresee the momentum of these accomplishments carrying over into this administration?
I do, Congressman.
What are some of the obstacles that you see in continuing these successes, and what can we do to help overcome them?
I think the degree of cooperation for exchange of information is productive. I think that needs to continue. And if we wind up having obstacles in that area, it would be of concern. Right now, the ability to information share with Israel mill to mill is very, very effective.
Ms. Cooper, could you explain the current state of the Department of Defense's assessment regarding a transfer of Israel from European Command to the Central Command area of operations?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. The current state of play is that there was a decision to effect the transfer, but that transfer is still in process, in the sense that we are carefully analyzing every aspect to ensure that only when we are confident that it will be a seamless transition will that formal transition occur. And the concept here is to ensure that there's nothing that is impacted negatively in terms of Israel's tremendous relationship with European allies and with European Command, but only that Israel will benefit from greater access to mill-to-mill relationships in the Central Command area of responsibility. So that's the criteria we're looking at. Over.
Okay, and thank you both for your service and for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Loria is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And General Walters, I wanted to shift back to the discussion that some of my colleagues brought up earlier about naval presence in the EUCOM theater. And I had an opportunity to discuss this specifically a little bit yesterday with General Van Herk relative to the Arctic and kind of how the forces are allocated when we look at the Arctic and having 3 combatant commanders whose geographic areas converge on that area. So essentially with U.S. INDOPACOM, they have a large number of forces assigned, Forces 4. You have some naval forces assigned, but not particularly attributed to that mission, more in tune with conducting ballistic missile defense and operating in the Mediterranean. And U.S. NORTHCOM has 0 naval forces assigned by the Forces 4 document. Can you first describe any additional needs you feel that you have for naval forces? I know you mentioned 2 destroyers earlier, but specifically with regards to the Arctic. And then furthermore, do you have any concerns about the command and control, the operability for sort of a unified command when countering threats in the Arctic because of the 3 combatant commanders having geographic areas that intersect in basically one theater?
Well, Congresswoman, with respect to the command and control between the 3 U.S. combatant commanders, I'm very comfortable. We've operated for decades across unified command plan boundaries, and we understand ADCON, OPCON, and TACON. As far as needs in the region are concerned, from a U.S. perspective, as you well know, through many of your initiatives, we've worked with the Coast Guard, and we plan on going the direction of the addition of 6 additional icebreakers in the future. And I think that's very, very important. And my request with respect to the 2 DDGs has everything to do with the Arctic and what's on the periphery with respect to what happens in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. I'm very pleased with the European nations' increase in involvement in the Arctic region. The Northern Sea route is very precious to them. It's a treasure that the nations understand that we need to protect it, and they're getting very, very involved with respect to establishing military plans to assist in that cause. So I think the campaign momentum with respect to U.S. activities, all the plans that all the U.S. services have just recently completed for the Arctic strategy, as well as codifying plans on behalf of our allies and partners to assist, is very helpful.
Well, thank you. And can you clarify, are you looking for 2 additional destroyers to be permanently assigned to the EUCOM AOR, or are you looking for rotational forces that would deploy from elsewhere on the East Coast?
It's a request for permanence, ma'am.
Permanent. So then wouldn't be 2 on station all the time. It would be a rotational force, but 4 deployed to the European theater.
We currently have a set number of 4, and the request is for 2 additional, and we have infrastructure in place to be able to house all 6 in Rota, Spain.
Okay, understand that. So, going back to the multiple combatant commanders who intersect in the Arctic theater, my question about Second Fleet. So the Navy recently, a few years back, stood up Second Fleet again, and when Admiral Richardson announced the, reestablishment of Second Fleet, he said that this was a fleet that would operate seamlessly from the east coast of the United States to the Barents Sea. And that covers 2 theaters, both the NORTHCOM AOR and part of the EUCOM AOR. And then recently the Harry S. Truman operated above the Arctic Circle doing exercises, and I understand that they were under U.S. EUCOM command during that exercise. Does the current arrangement with Second Fleet being a numbered fleet that spans 2 combatant command AORs, do you see any operational concerns with that arrangement?
We're very comfortable with that arrangement, and it's done in other domains often. And Second Fleet, coupled with JFC Norfolk, that I know you're familiar with, Congresswoman, we've worked out the C2 relationships in a supported and supporting construct, and I'm very comfortable with the path that we're currently on.
Okay, and then just in the little time remaining, other than the request for 2 additional DDGs, do you feel that you receive adequate naval presence in the EUCOM AOR to meet all of your missions on a regular basis?
We could still use some more support in undersea activity, and I would adore the chance to talk to that in a separate venue.
Okay, thank you, and I'll yield back the time remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wanted to give our witnesses the opportunity to just discuss the importance of air dominance in Europe.
Congressman, I'll take a stab at that because it's near and dear to my heart. It's a campaign imperative to ensure that we can comprehensively defend and share our responses and achieve effective deterrence in Europe. And it will dramatically improve with the addition of the United States F-35s that start coming into the United Kingdom in the fall of 2021.
And I know that when we make decisions about air platforms, we're often analyzing the entourage effect, how the F-35 can make the rest of the fighting force more capable. As the F-35 starts to really take its position as the dominant air platform in Europe with our allies, can we expect that they'll be able to scale and do more in their own defense as a consequence of that entourage effect that we seem to analyze very closely in our own fighting force?
Absolutely, Congressman. We have 81 F-35s in continent as we speak. We anticipate that we'll get to 450 by 2030. The F-35's contribution at the tactical level and its ability to achieve access is unequaled anywhere in the world, but its contributions at the strategic level for indications and warnings, command and control, and lethality from a mission command standpoint are daunting.
Obviously, where the chairman mentioned, we're all concerned about Turkey and their S-400 purchase. Is there another shoe that we expect to drop? Is there anything you've picked up at the mill-to-mill level that should give us cause for concern that U.S. products, U.S. capabilities are diminished in the attractiveness to some of our partners?
Congressman, I haven't. The mill-to-mill relationship that I have with Turkey at this moment remains very strong.
With any other of our partner nations, are there any places where you see that we might ought to give particular focus or attention when it comes to ensuring interoperability and capability with U.S. warfighters in Europe?
We work that every day, Congressman. I think that's a requirement 24/7, 365. I think what we've done recently with respect to the codification of actual plans at the strategic level and at the national level is a forcing function to allow nations to ultimately establish requirements. And that in itself has been very, very helpful so that we don't have unnecessary duplicity, and the alignment of our hardware and software and troopers is what it needs to be to better generate peace. I think we're traversing in the right direction. And truthfully, Congressman, a big contributor in this area has been the European Deterrence Initiative to get after these issues.
No, I appreciate that. I just was giving you the chance if you thought there was any other area where we ought to have this focus, because I know in armed services we had a number of discussions about Turkey's decision before it arose, and maybe we should have done more to ensure that that was the right decision. But it seems as though you're saying there is not something with that level of acuity that we ought to be concerned about. If there is, I would ask that you provide that to our office as part of the record. I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. We're currently seeing a rise in liberal and authoritarian states throughout Europe. I know there's been a lot of talk about Turkey, but we also have seen that authoritarian cases in Poland and Hungary, and some of these governments are no longer being reliable or helpful partners. I know we've already talked about the F-35 program with Turkey, but Ms. Cooper, I was wondering, in your assessment, how does the Biden administration plan to update its military partnerships or alliances with states that take repeated actions that go directly against our core interests? And are these authoritarian developments being considered as the department works to implement its plan to realign U.S. force posture in Europe? I'm particularly interested in Poland, where we have a rotating armored brigade combat team.
Thank you. I would say that the Biden administration's policies regarding democracy and regarding the promotion of U.S. values are very strong. And so this is something that we feel not just over at the State Department in Foggy Bottom, but at the Pentagon. So in general, this is an important focus for the administration. With respect to specific alliance relationships, we are still working very hard in the context of the NATO alliance to forge strong capabilities and a strong ability to deter Russian aggression and respond should Russia proceed with aggression. And that is where our NATO-related mill-to-mill investments occur. And in the case of Poland specifically, we do have this rotational presence that we are continuing with.
Thank you. And on the question of Russia, the question for both Ms. Cooper and General Walters is why you think sanctions are going to work on Russia, since we have put them on in the past and it's not been effective in deterring Russian hacking. And if anything, the problem has gotten worse. And I understand if we need to go into more detail in this in the classified briefing later, but just wondering what the rationale is for continuing a process of sanctions that has seemed, to me at least, fairly ineffective to this point.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would urge members of Congress to take a close look at the specific sanctions that we are releasing today, because the details in the package, I think, do speak to a level of clarity of purpose and clarity of messaging that perhaps we have not always had. In terms of the new executive order that President Biden is signing, this will enable us to have a tool that we can use not just today, but also in the future to message our deterrence of future Russian malign activities. So I do think it's important to look at the specifics. But it's not just sanctions. I mean, we're not just doing sanctions. And it's coupled with other measures. To include today, we are proceeding with the expulsion of 10 Russian officers in the United States. And most importantly, it revolves around alliance unity. I was very encouraged to see that it wasn't just the voice of the United States today calling out Russian malign actions. It was also NATO, because we have a NATO statement that was issued today. So we are all standing together, unified. This is something that Russia does notice and that can, I think, in the future deter their malign behavior.
Thank you. General, anything to add there?
Congressman, anything we can do to continue to curb malign behavior on behalf of Russia and improve our deterrence posture, I'm in support of.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you both being here. And as a third-year Air Force guy, real proud of General Walters and all the great work you're doing. My first question is dealing with the Baltics. With what we're seeing with the Russians are doing with Ukraine and Georgia, what can we do more to assure deterrence with our great allies in the Baltics? And part of that, would you consider having a permanent U.S. force in the Baltics to make that deterrence more assured? And I defer to either one.
Sir, great question. Number one, I think the glide path that we're on with enhanced forward presence has been very successful, and I know you're familiar with it, and I know you visited. It affords the NATO nations to lead from the front and participate to a greater degree. I believe that the current rotational presence that we have back and forth from a U.S. perspective with respect to Poland and what we do with the other nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, is about right. It continues to promote all involvement from many of our allies and partners, and the success that we're having with those battalion-sized battle groups in each one of those 4 nations, possessing the capability to inherit and input all domain data is improving our ability to adequately deter in that region.
I'm the co-chair of the Baltic Security Caucus, so we put a lot of time on this. I just fear if we ever have conflict in Europe, it's going to probably evolve around the Baltic states. So I just think we have to be so careful to ensure there is no miscalculation by the Russians there. So obviously I'm for strengthening our deterrence capabilities there and leaving any ambiguity out when it comes to that. To the Russian gas question, there are some bases that are reliant on Russian gas. And the reason I know that, we put it in law that the services have to ask for a waiver to do it, and we know the Army has done that. So for example, the new hospital being built in Germany will be using Russian gas. Does it concern either one of you, or what can we do about this? Because I think when the Russians can just turn off the gas, we got a problem.
It does, Congressman, and I'm very familiar with Rhine Ordnance Barrack Hospital and the construction project, having commanded the air component at Ramstein, being part and parcel of that equation. I think we have to continue with the demanding customer that we have been up to this point to purge it out of the system, and our reliance on that should ultimately be a campaign that drives us to zero.
Thank you. I know you've already talked to some F-35 questions here, but I got to follow up on it. I was just reading that in some of the training, we're looking at 20-to-1 kill ratios. I even saw one where it was 100-to-1. Would you say the F-35 is unmatched and its capability in your theater?
Yes.
Now, there have been some folks who want to cut the F-35 program. What is the impact to your theater if this F-35 program is reduced in production?
It'll reduce our campaign momentum to more effectively see the environment from an indications and warning standpoint, command and control and provide feedback as to what is taking place in the environment. And from a lethality perspective, the ability to put potential targets at risk will be weakened.
You've flown in the F-35?
I've flown the F-22. I
Okay.
have not flown the F-35.
I was just curious, because you could compare and contrast if you had. I got a minute left, so I want to ask one other question on electronic warfare. 4 years ago, when we took stock of electronic warfare, we were behind Russia and China. We stepped away from it from the mid-90s. We've put a lot of emphasis in this committee on trying to get this on track. Are you seeing the work bearing fruit over the last 4 years? Are we right-sizing our electronic warfare program?
Congressman, we're improving, probably not at a rate that pleases you or I, and the acquisition and the proliferation of the F-35 will actually help in that arena.
Okay. Well, thank you. I yield back, and I appreciate you both.
I do apologize for this, but I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to follow up a little bit. What impact? I mean, the F-35 is $38,000 an hour right now. We wanted to get it at $25,000 an hour. Its mission-ready capability is sub 50% at the moment, and by 2030, the engine is requiring so much repairs that roughly half the fleet won't be able to go just because we don't have the facilities to repair the engines, and we won't have enough engines. If that is the capability that you're getting, $38,000 an hour, 33% to 40% capability rate, sinking down because it doesn't have a functioning engine, how will that impact your ability to do what you need to do in Europe?
Congressman, that will certainly have an impact, but we weigh it all together given what effect can be delivered in the battle space, but obviously it would have an impact.
So it would be helpful if this committee would put pressure on those making the F-35 to actually deliver the product that they told us they were going to deliver at the price that they told us that they were going to deliver it at. And it would not be helpful to simply give them a free pass on those important issues.
Chairman, I applaud your efforts up to this point in that category, and I don't argue with any of those points.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That was more rhetorical than anything, but that's what I hope this committee will do. I mean, the platform's fantastic. There isn't any question about that. We are right now not getting what we are paying for, and that's not good for defense, and it certainly isn't good for the taxpayer. With that, I will yield to Ms. Strickland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'd like to talk a bit about protecting service members and their families when they're deployed, especially given how the Kremlin and other adversaries are targeting them with misinformation and disinformation. So I understand that when service members are deployed in EUCOM's AOR, that Russian disinformation campaigns are especially interested in service members and their families. Can you discuss, as much as you can in this open setting, what EUCOM is doing to combat disinformation, how we're educating service members, and how we're improving their awareness of this possibility? Thank you.
Thanks, Congresswoman. That's a great question. Again, we've instituted programs with the assistance of Special Operations Command that start at the very top, at the strategic level, to go after malign influence and misinformation to active duty members, reservists, guardsmen, and their dependents. The Operation Influence platform is specifically designed to target misinformation at the strategic and operational levels from Russia. And we've got a follow-on program called WebOps that takes it even further to make sure that there's a heightened awareness on behalf of all of the military members and the dependents in the EUCOM AOR about the malign influence from the information domain with respect to Russia.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper?
Well, I can just add to this at the strategic level in terms of the whole of government effort that we have to counter Russian disinformation. And actually, this is something that General Walters plays a leadership role in because he is the co-chair with the State Department of the Russia Influence Group. And so even as we're dealing with these issues at the local level, at the installation level, at the individual level, at the strategic level, our focus is on improving whole of government coordination to address Russian disinformation.
Great. And can you talk a bit more about the families? Because sometimes they can be vulnerable, especially when their loved ones are deployed.
We have the luxury of hosting families in Europe for decades and decades. And this is a constant challenge to make sure that the military members conduct town hall meetings at the commander level and the lower levels to ensure that there is no degree of satisfaction when just the military member is informed. The mission isn't complete until the rest of the family members are. And we obviously use 21st century means to get that word out. But it's like anything else, Congresswoman, you have to rebrief the same subject about 10 times to convince yourself that the word is actually out. And we find ourselves in situations to where we have to be comprehensive from a town hall perspective to make sure that we can go person to person to get the word out. And it's been a little bit challenging as a result of COVID-19 conditions. And I think this is driving a lot of your questions. And we have worked very hard to conduct town hall meetings with restrictions applied from a COVID perspective and are having success.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for that. And we know that in general, messages start to sink in when we do repeat them. So I appreciate your repetition strategy. That's all I have. I yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Waltz is recognized for 5 minutes. I don't think your microphone is on there.
How are we doing now? There we are. All right. Hey, thank you for both being here. I want to talk to you about our European partners, our NATO partners' significant contributions to Afghanistan over the last couple of decades. Ms. Cooper and I have spent many efforts working with them to live up to those contributions and live up to those pledges. And fortunately, I actually had more troops on the ground than the United States until the announcement yesterday. I'm hearing from many of my colleagues and then also reading about grumbling and discontent and concern, frankly, from, particularly from the Czechs, the Belgians, some of the Eastern European states, and those that were affected so directly by the precipitous pullout of Iraq. When ISIS then came charging to the fore, we had a caliphate the size of Indiana, attacks into and around Europe, into European capitals. The intelligence community has been clear that terrorism loves a vacuum. Al-Qaeda is very likely to take advantage of that vacuum in the wake of our withdrawal. What are you hearing from a military standpoint, and also to your military-to-military contacts on the civilian side? Are those concerns mirroring what I'm hearing in terms of Europe's safety, number one, but then number two, our ability to effect a CT fight over, with this term, over the horizon, noting the differences, our basing options in and around Iraq are very different and far greater than they are without Bagram in Afghanistan.
First and foremost, Congressman, and I know you appreciate this, as the United States, we are incredibly grateful for the contributions of all the nations. And secondly, with this being a order, we will conduct a deliberate, very well synchronized, and very safe from a force protection standpoint withdrawal. Yesterday, as you may have heard at the North Atlantic Council, the Secretary General convened all of the members of the alliance to include the partner nations that have an impact in the region, and the support was resounding for enactment of the withdrawal.
And Congressman, I would just add that kind of at the policy level, so the feedback that I have heard from my colleagues who have been traveling with the Secretary and were there in Brussels for this meeting is a sense of appreciation by allies for the manner in which we have consulted with them since the beginning of this administration to take into account their perspectives, to have Secretary Austin and Secretary Biden personally engaging with them in person. And also the sense that they also have been reflecting on the way ahead and concerned about the future of the mission even before this. And I think moving forward.
So, Ms. Cooper, sorry, yeah, go ahead. That's the part I want to talk about moving forward.
I think moving forward, the expectation, and I think it's an expectation that we will absolutely meet, is for this very close consultation process to continue every step of the way, so that we are working on this withdrawal plan and we are executing it absolutely together as an alliance.
Our European partners will be the first to feel the consequences of this decision. If history bears true in what they felt with the withdrawal of Iraq and the ISIS caliphate. So I certainly hope those consultations are ongoing, but I do not see a plan in place and basing options for continuing counterterrorism operations. Are the Europeans planning to contend or to participate in those operations with us as they have in Syria? What's the plan?
We'll start and conduct a synchronized withdrawal, and the intention of the European nations is obviously by, with, and through those nations, to be determined.
Okay, so the plan is TBD, to be determined. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. VC is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. General Walters, can you talk a little bit about Russia's military modernization program and what modernization efforts are most important for us to focus on to reduce operational risk in your command?
The one that is of most concern, Congressman, is the long-range missile capability. And we at NATO are very focused on that. We certainly, from a U.S. perspective, are focused on that. And the key for us is to continue to improve our ability from an indications and warning standpoint and from a command and control standpoint to make sure that we can characterize the environment and be able to respond. That's probably the biggest concern, Congressman.
No, thank you very much. Last week, I was at a rollout ceremony in Fort Worth with the Danish military receiving F-35s. And as you know, they're obviously one of our key allies and participants in the F-35 program. And I was just wondering, what was your opinion on the F-35 and the impact that it's had both militarily and diplomatically with our allies in the region?
Congressman, we're very fond of the F-35 because of its contributions to indications and warnings and command and control and lethality. The nations in Europe have been very happy with the product. We actually have just over 80 F-35s, non-U.S., in Europe as we speak, and we will soon get U.S. F-35s to the United Kingdom in the fall timeframe. And we are currently programmed to go up to approximately 450 F-35s by 2030 throughout all of Europe. We're very pleased with its performance, and we're very pleased with its contributions to deterrence.
And I hate to ask you to go back too far into the history vault, but with other platforms where there have been issues, and that the military has had to work with to perfect, whether it has been a plane, a helicopter, battleship, regardless of what it is, for the mission that you need for F-35 to perform for you right now, and you go back and you look at other platforms where you've also had to work with them until they could perform at the rate that you wanted them to. Where do you see this platform at right now versus, again, just other problems in the past that you had to correct? I mean, I remember when I was, at the beginning of the V-22, for instance, that there were some serious issues with that. But, Bell Helicopter eventually got that right, and it's gone on to become a good platform, for the Marines and other branches. And so could you just sort of touch on that a little bit?
Congressman, the other platforms that I've seen during my service in the military, we've had the same experiences. And if I were to rate the F-35 with others, I would just tell you that they're similar.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The questions I have may be better served in the classified hearing, but I'll go ahead and just throw them out there now. I really want to hear, we've talked a lot about the F-35, and certainly I could maybe ask some additional questions, but I really would like to know about how you are battling the cyber issues that are happening with our adversaries, especially as it relates to Russia and what's happening in that part of the region.
Congresswoman, I think that the question had to do with malign influence on behalf of adversaries with respect to cyber. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I'll just start out by saying that the posture in Europe has improved significantly. As far as the organizations that we have from a U.S. EUCOM perspective, we have a joint cyber center. I have an integrated planning element, and with my SAC hat, I have a SHAPE Cyber Operations Center. And those three organizations come to a total of about 150 individuals. On top of that, we have cyber protection teams in the United States, manned by the United States Army at Fort Gordon. And many of the nations in Europe today are forming cyber organizations from a military perspective. And I believe that because several years ago, the United States made the decision to establish one military commander for cyber, the U.S. Cybercom commander. Our direction and guidance has been much clearer, with much less ambiguity, and the command and control and the organization of our units is much better. So we're improving, and the NATO nations are watching that improvement, and they are following in suit, and we are seeing a marked improvement on behalf of our NATO militaries to improve our effectiveness, number one, to better defend on the network, and then number two, worry about the other aspects of cyber after that, once they're convinced that their nations and their militaries and their whole of governments have effective network defense.
And if I may, I think it might be helpful to offer a national level perspective on this cyber question. And I think the SolarWinds response that we announced today is really a microcosm of how we handle cyber issues at the national level. There's a piece of this that relates to specifically disrupting and imposing costs on Russian cyber actors. So what you're seeing today is that we are sanctioning 6 specific Russian companies that support the Russian intelligence services. This is the SVR. So we're actually sanctioning these specific companies. Then you also see an element of this that relates to raising awareness and providing the private sector with the information and tools they need to be able to protect themselves. So there's an aspect of that with the SolarWinds response. And then there's a building partner capacity piece, where we're working with our allies and partners to help them become more resilient. And we have expanded our own cyber flag exercise that is, one of our premier cyber exercises to include several allies as part of this response.
And a follow-up to that, do you feel like it would be in our best interest to invest more in this specific space to help mitigate some of the things that we're seeing?
I would say this is a whole of government space. So I think we have to be looking at not just the Defense Department, but at our civilian agency counterparts and their investments in this space. And then it's also about the private sector. We have to partner with the private sector. We have to share information with the private sector. And we also have to encourage the private sector to make themselves more resilient. That's also why today we are reaching out to the private sector and encouraging U.S. and international companies to not rely on Russian software providers, Russian IT companies, because this can lead to a critical vulnerability.
We may want to add China to that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. We have 4 people left in 10 minutes. The math doesn't quite add up, but if those 4 people move through quickly, we hopefully will be able to get to all 4, but we do have to stop at 1:20. With that announcement, Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. And thanks to our witnesses for being here, as well as, and of course, your service. Look, in November of 2020, I got to say I was and a number of other of my colleagues were absolutely disappointed by the withdrawal of the United States from the Open Skies Treaty, which basically we saw the consequences of Russia withdrawing as well. I think some of the best examples of the benefits of the Open Skies Treaty were in 2014 when we were able to confirm the deployment of thousands of troops, Russian troops, near the Ukrainian border, as well as in 2018 when we conducted a flight following the unprovoked Russian attack of Ukrainian vessels in the Kerch Strait. I do believe that the treaty is worth it, based not only on the images, but to the value that our allies have in it, especially our Eastern European partners and friends. That's why I introduced the Open Skies Stability Act to let our allies know that we in Congress felt that way about the Open Skies Treaty and the value that it brings to the stability and peace, especially of Europe. My question to you is, what do you feel the future is of the Open Skies Treaty for the remaining 32 members? And does it serve a purpose without the participation of the United States and Russia?
I will attempt to answer this quickly, Congressman, given the time, but this is actually a very complex subject. And since it was actually my office that led the charge on that flight that you mentioned over Ukraine after the Kerch Strait attack, this is near and dear to my heart. What I will say to you is that first of all, we have been very open to consultations with allies and partners on the range of conventional arms control requirements and concerns, to include the Open Skies Treaty. And we have, the Biden administration has reached out to allies to open this dialogue as the administration considers the way forward on all arms control agreements. So I think that's very important to note, and I think that's something that allies have appreciated. I will say, though, that from an intelligence value, the Open Skies Treaty does have very limited intelligence value for the United States. And even in that instance that I was very proud of, actually, where we had that imagery following the Kerch Strait attack, we haven't necessarily been able to capitalize on the benefits of those opportunities. So at this point, we are in consultation with allies. We know that Russia values flying over the U.S. homeland as part of the treaty. And I certainly can't speak to whether Russia would actually come back into compliance, which is really the core issue here. Russia has given us no indication that it would be willing to come back into compliance.
General Walters?
Congressman, I concur with Laura Cooper's comments on the consultation with allies, and I've received the same reflections. Thank you.
Okay. Fair enough. Knowing that the other questions, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Franklin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses here this morning. You've covered a lot of ground on the unclassed level, and I do have some things I want to dive into deeper. But just quickly for General Walters, we haven't discussed sea lift, strategic sea lift. It's often an area that gets overlooked. But could you talk a little bit about the role strategic sea lift plays in our efforts to deter Russia, an assessment of our capabilities, and do we have the tools necessary for you to implement strategy in EUCOM AOR?
We do, Congressman, but it relies on advanced warning, and as you know, our TRANSCOM commander works this issues every second of the day. We were able to test sea lift to a certain degree with Defender Europe 20. We didn't get the full, complete test. We certainly have some challenges, but when we have good indications and warnings, and we can move our operations farther and farther to the left to supply, we can typically wind up putting ourselves in a position to where we can put resources where they need to be effective. And right now, for what is required on the European continent, we can be effective.
Very good. Thank you, General. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, very, very good witness.
Thank you for the testimony. Ms. Cooper, thank you. Particularly delighted to see the sanctions coming at a very, very important moment, having to do with Ukraine and other things that Russia up to now, let alone what they've been doing in the past. A very good message. My recollection is that every year or every other year, the Russians do an exercise in the western part of their country, north one year, south the next year. This is the south year?
It is, Congressman.
Okay. I don't expect an answer now, but I want in detail, because of the work that we need to do in the NDAA, the posture in Europe with regard to EDI and the specific MILCON and other issues. Some $1.7 billion was removed last year and the year before in that area. Do we replace it or not? It's a long answer, and I'll take it in yes, General.
36 projects at $1.6 billion, and we're working very, very hard to execute 34 of the 36. But obviously, it depends on future budget. But we're on course to go that direction.
Very good. We need the details. Also, President Trump said he was going to move a whole lot of things out of Europe and into Europe and other places. Has that been reversed? If so, what do we do? And where does the future go, Ms. Cooper?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I will just say that on posture in general, there is a global posture review that is kicking off right now in the Pentagon. And so we will be studying all of these issues, global posture, and this summer we will have the Biden administration's conclusions. But with respect specifically to Europe, President Biden did lift the troop cap in Germany. He announced that at the Munich Security Conference. And then we were talking earlier today about the 500 additional forces that Secretary Austin just announced for Germany.
I understand, and there were many other things also in play. So your timing doesn't quite work out with our timing. So let's coordinate our timing with regard to these issues. And finally, the issue of NATO. It appears as though there is a sea change from disrespecting NATO to respecting NATO and working with NATO. Is that correct?
The Biden administration has been very clear that NATO and alliances are central to its policy, and I think our allies have responded very appreciatively.
General, would you like to comment?
Congressman, I've seen no breakdown in trust of our NATO nations with the United States.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Walters, it's an honor to be with you. And I particularly appreciated I'm the grateful son of a flying tiger who served in India and China during World War II. And I know the difference you can make on behalf of promoting freedom and liberty. Additionally, I'm very grateful that I had led a delegation, General, to Poland in 2017. I was there with, gratefully, with Congressman Garamendi. And in Poland, visiting with our personnel in Operation Atlantic Resolve, it's been so inspiring, and that has a personal connection too. My daughter-in-law, Jennifer Miskowitz, her heritage is Krakow, Poland. And so to see us working together with our Polish allies, how important it is. And what is the most recent progress that's been made with the joint declaration that we have with our headquarters and possibly to have a headquarters unit in Poland?
Congressman, all those efforts with the enhanced defense cooperation agreement with Poland are in work. We've received tremendous contributions from Poland with respect to working some of our construction projects, and we're very excited about the status of the 5th Floor Command Post coming in, and Poland's willingness to work on their infrastructure to receive our rotational forces and the improvements that they've made on their ranges. So we're traversing in a very good direction with Poland.
Well, it is so inspiring to be there and visit with our Polish allies. And for Secretary Cooper, I'm so pleased that with the Biden administration indicating a clear association with our allies of Ukraine and also Moldova, additionally Poland, Georgia, working with Romania and Bulgaria. I appreciate the President's restatement of our appreciation in all of these countries. And with that, what can we do to be more effective in our working with our allies of Eastern Europe?
Congressman, I think that we are on the right track to work with our allies both to build their capacity to be able to be resilient against their near threat, Russia, but also to be interoperable with U.S. forces and with NATO. So I feel like we have the right mix of train and equip programs. We also need to be vocal in our support of them. Right now, with the pressure that Ukraine is facing, Ukraine has really appreciated not just the fact that we're providing them with tremendous high-quality equipment and high-quality training, but the fact that we're publicly vocal in our support of their sovereignty.
Well, thank you for your efforts, and it's been inspiring to visit Novo Selo, the joint NATO Bulgarian-American base. It's exciting to see our allies working together. Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Thank you. We are a couple minutes over time here, and we got to get over for the classified briefing. So I just want to close with one quick thing, and that is I really want to thank the staff. You know, we've made a couple jokes about the technological issues here. It's not easy. And the staff has really made this work in a way that has been enormously helpful. So I really appreciate the technological wizards who have enabled us to continue to do the hybrid hearings the way we've done them. So, and appreciate you sitting through all that. And we'll give you just a brief little break before we reconvene at 2 o'clock in the CVC. With that, we are adjourned.